Gun giveaway. Well, now that I have your attention, the Your Mountain podcast is working with Gunworks, Vortex Optics, Federal Premium Ammunition, Viking Tactics, Proof Research, Timely Triggers, and Magpul to put together a package of the components necessary for you to build a better gun. Go to www.itsyourmountain.com and look for the gun giveaway on our website. There you can find out how to enter in addition to review the rules and restrictions to this gun giveaway. Make sure you get your entry in by May 1st, 2019. So head it over to www.itsyourmountain.com. Now on to the show.
There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is Your Mountain. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Your Mountain podcast. This is David Wilms. I'm joined, as always, by Mike McGrady and Nephi Cole.
Hey.
Hey, I'm glad you're still here.
Thank you. And I'm glad you're still here as well.
I was worried about you this week.
Why is that?
Because you slept in a place, I heard you stayed in a hotel that was I'm not going to say the name of the hotel or what beautiful city it was in, but let's just say that, you shouldn't live in some place that, that used to be a slaughterhouse. You shouldn't rent a room there to stay in.
I had to make a decision from when a hotel lists amenities, the amenities provided. I was faced with a choice, sort of a Sophie's choice kind of situation here. I had to decide, did I want the room that had heat or did I want the room that had light? And you couldn't have both.
Yeah.
That you could have one or the other.
What a perfect metaphor.
It was this hotel is a story for another day. I'll read you my TripAdvisor review.
It's not for a short podcast.
It is not for a short podcast, which is what this one is. But it was needless to say, it was a good experience. I stayed warm, which tells you which amenity I chose.
That's because iPhones have flashlights.
It's exactly right. Anyway, so tonight, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
That's interesting. Where's that written at?
I swear I'd heard that someplace before.
Sounds like 1789 language.
Ish. It kind of just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it?
Yeah.
27 words.
Yeah, you might have heard it.
Yeah. I think I'm no lawyer, but I think it's in the Constitution.
You're right. You're not a lawyer. But you are also correct.
Yeah. The Second Amendment's been getting a lot of attention lately. There was a recent federal court decision out of California that struck down that state's ban on, their magazine ban. That said they couldn't limit at 10 the number of rounds that could be held in the magazine, that's caused a lot of fear because that 86-page decision went, it didn't just stop at magazines. It talked about a lot of stuff, and so that's got a lot of people talking. In addition, everybody knows that this topic, the Second Amendment, has been a hot topic this year in the political cycle. It continues to be something that's very popular to talk about, on the progressive side. And so we figured it was, a great opportunity to talk about old stuff.
Yeah, but you're right. Talk about old stuff. Because you're spot on. It's not only in the fabric of the debate today; it's in the fabric of the debate yesterday and for the past 20 years, for our lifetime. Right? What does the Second Amendment really mean? How
is it tied to hunting? And what does it mean to us?
Right. But how can But today we're talking about. Today, as in the context of not this podcast, but today generally with the Second Amendment, it's all the conversations around. Well, can you regulate this firearm or that firearm, or should you regulate, or where should you regulate, in cities, not in cities? But it's driven by
there's a lot of specific instances,
right? Very specific instances, a lot of tragic instances. some that aren't tragic. I mean, there's a whole host of things that go into this debate. That's not what this podcast is about.
No.
Right? This podcast is about really
foundational.
How did we get to the point where we had a Second Amendment? And what is the relationship between the Second Amendment and hunting?
And it's fascinating.
It is. So Nephi, you want to start us off? You want to take us back
1.7 million years ago is how far back I'm going.
What's the song? I'm going back in time.
Yeah. Well,
remember that song?
Oh, I remember it.
You want me to keep going?
No.
Let's get in the phone booth, ladies and gentlemen. We're getting in the phone booth.
Are we mixing movies here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
we are. This isn't Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. It's also not necessarily Back to the Future. But we are going back in time.
A long time, at least the Pleistocene. So you see, that
this is. I think this. By the way, I think this is our second podcast where we've gone back to the Pleistocene.
Well, that's where you start finding the evidence. And so when you look again from thousands to millions of years ago, you see this evidence of humans hunting. And so how do we know this? In a large part, you know this because of the tools that were found. So it's evidence in the animals, and it's the tools that were found. And so those tools we're talking about when we talk about the right to keep and bear arms. We're talking about arms. We're talking about tools that are used for defense, tools that are used for foraging, for hunting.
And to be clear, when you're talking the Pleistocene, you are not talking about in North America.
You're correct.
Yeah, and when is the Pleistocene?
You're asking the wrong guy.
You got to have some.
Because that was not in. I am not going to because I was supposed to know this in a test.
We need some frame of reference. How long ago are we?
We're talking about
here?
a million years. We're talking about a long time ago.
Almost 2 million. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And so moving forward from that, you find evidence of different ways that weapons were used, including in conflicts with other humans. 10,000 years ago, you're finding, evidence in swamps in Africa where you find 30 individuals with tool marks, in various, parts of their head and things like that say, this is where an obsidian weapon was used, by one population of people against another. So, when you look at the right to keep and bear arms in, I'd say more modern times. So now we're looking at, the birth of Christ forward to where we are now. You have, it's so old that you can't really find the start of it. But it's fair to say that the Germanic tribes recognized it in about 1690. It was brought to the Saxons, and I'm going to concentrate a lot on kind of, the Britain, Ireland, Scotland area, that around that time, 5th, 6th century, that bearing of arms was a right and a responsibility of free men. Fair to say? I
don't know. You tell me.
It is. Blackstone indicated that the English system existed at least in the 9th century.
Who's Blackstone?
Dave?
I'm asking you. You're the legal scholar. No.
Well, if you were paying attention before one of our previous podcasts,
Blackstone is sort of the preeminent legal scholar, English legal scholar in history, widely regarded as the preeminent legal scholar of English law.
Right. Modern history of English law. Yeah.
Right. So when you're referencing Blackstone here, I just want people to know that are listening who Blackstone is. So there you go. And Mike, we've talked about Blackstone before.
Tell me what year you want to come in and start talking, because...
No, keep going. I'm just asking questions.
Well, there's just so much, and to me it's just fascinating. So this is I did a deep dive into this myself, preparation for this podcast, where you started to see, especially out of the British Isles, this concept. And again, it's medieval, this concept of individuals and a responsibility of those individuals, depending on where they're, free men to be armed. So, Henry II promulgated.
What do you think that was? What? And we don't necessarily. This might be complete hypothesizing.
It's all hypothesized, I think.
But
why do you think that was? Because I have an idea.
So you're going back to 600 and saying so here's my question: Is it a right then, I mean, you're saying you were finding in your research that it was started to be recognized as a right.
It's like
this right
an
to
expectation.
But is it? That's what I was going to say. Is it a right or an expectation or responsibility?
It was both.
And in what way? So you said you have a hypothesis. I'm just going to throw one out. This is a blind guess. I want to be absolutely completely clear. I have not researched this at all. Blind guess. Mm-hmm. But it strikes me that if you were going back in time and looking at history and you've got kingdoms kind of fighting with each other, that you need an armed citizenry to help defend the kingdom.
Yep. And you know what's interesting, where it's kind of this idea that Germanics started from? So you had one group, right? Who was the group that was trying to take over that area?
You tell me.
The Romans.
Yeah, okay.
And so you had these professional soldiers, you had this professional war machine, right? And then that's my hypothesis, right? And then out of this conflict with this, professional army came this other group of guys who were basically forest men, right? Guys.
Doesn't that sound familiar?
Yeah. And so the expectation was that these guys they came together and that they would be able to, and they did successfully, beat that back.
You know what's hilarious is we might, in this conversation, and both of us sound very convincing here. Uh-huh. We might be completely rewriting history.
So let us know. But no, and but
I think it's a
the
good
tough part
hypothesis.
is that people can't really, there's a lot of it that is just conjecture. And so when you get over to the Saxons in England and kind of how things went there, part of what we do know is that there's a distinct difference that you can read about when you look at how things were in the British Isles and went from let's just say the 7th century up to the 1500s, and then on the other side of the Channel, you had a monarchy on one side of the Channel, in Britain, that was very much almost a democratic monarchy, and that you had that. The history there was that the king almost got to exist at the will of the people. And I say that because it was, so when you look at, 1100 British, so Henry II, he promulgated a law that all British citizens between 15 and 40 had to be armed. So if you were an able-bodied man...
So you didn't say the year 1540. You said British citizens
between
the age...
15
between
years
the
of
age
age
and
40 years of age.
But do you know what year that was?
That was 1180.
1181.
1181. Okay. And Henry II basically said the wealthiest have to have full armor, sword, a dagger, a war horse, and then even the poorest, the whole community, and it's quote, the whole community of freemen must have leather armor, helmet, and a lance. And so that was different than on the other side of the Channel, where where many of the kingdoms, the expectation was the only people to be armed were the noble. Mm-hmm. You had, in order to, and I think that this was self-preservation of the British Isles, was the expectation that in order to protect yourself from conquerors, this is what you did.
But it's one of the first places where you start to see because it was a requirement. It was a law to keep arms. That you probably see this manifest in the individual. That even though it's a requirement, it's also, can you make the stretch and say that maybe people viewed it as a right in some ways? I mean, I know we're hundreds of years away from that. But it plants the seed
for sure,
right? I mean, that kind of plants the seed of a culture where having weapons to be able to defend yourself and your country is inherent in the people, right?
Yeah. Well, and about the same time, so now let's juxtapose or compare it to hunting at the same time. Mm-hmm. At that time, hunting was basically legally reserved for the elite. It's the origin of that was the forest laws imposed by the Normans after the conquest. While Saxon kings possessed tracts of land throughout the country that were reserved for them, the introduction of the forest law was designated to protect animals that were important for the king's sport, the royal forests. And so while you had, on one hand, you had an expectation that you were armed, on the other side, there wasn't necessarily it wasn't necessarily like that went hand in hand with a right to hunt.
Sure. So have arms in case we need to send you off to war, but don't use them
against
in
our
the
sheep
interim
or whatever.
to hunt, to provide for your own family.
Yeah, so King John actually, 1166 to 1260, enacted more rigorous hunting regulations. He broadened the forest laws. He restricted hunting to include small game, which was viewed as extremely excessive, and it was bad on the lower classes. Then comes along the Magna Carta, which basically
was kind of right in that
Yep.
wheelhouse.
that kind of does away with what saw as overreach.
By the way,
King John.
I think now we've talked about the Magna Carta in about 5 different episodes. Turning out this is a pretty significant document in hunting and Second Amendment.
I would have looked at it a little closer next time. I've seen it before,
right?
I've seen a copy or one of the copies they made.
Yeah,
of it, right.
National Archives.
Yeah,
right?
National Archives, and I probably would have
maybe
read
it a little closer,
yeah.
or stared in it in great awe.
Yeah, I got it.
Maybe,
I was like, okay, yeah, this is really cool, but
you would have gawked at it a little harder had you known that it was the root of some.
It would have evoked more memories.
Some of the freedoms we have today.
Well, it ameliorated the forest laws. It forced John to release all the lands that had been added to the royal forest for the last generation, and it reduced those severe penalties on basically you weren't going to get killed anymore for killing a rabbit.
Yeah, because that was the penalty.
Yep.
That was and we've talked about this before, but we have poaching laws today that were laughable in 1200. Like, oh, you get a 2 pence fine for killing a rabbit. No, we're going to cut your hand off, or worse, murder you. You kill a rabbit, we kill you. That's a pretty good way to discourage somebody from illegally harvesting game, or in this instance, to suppress a class of citizens.
So it also results in mercenaries and foreign warriors being kicked out of the British Isles. And now moving forward again with the right to bear arms theme, let's go to Edward I, the Second, and the Third. You see a real, I don't know if you call it an expansion of this idea of an everyman army, but you do see it expand. So Edward I basically says everybody has to have a longbow. So he comes across this weapon at the time, which is a bow that's capable of piercing armor. And so that was the big deal with the longbow. The longbow was a weapon that put an ordinary man on not a level playing field, but he could defend himself from on night.
But so I want to make sure we're in the same time frame here, what we're talking about. So we went from having armed folks, this expectation of everybody being armed.
Yep.
Yet those folks had they couldn't hunt, right? Or they were restricted. Many of them were restricted in hunting.
You were restricted in where you could hunt. There were some areas that were common areas where people were able to, but they were few and far between. And then they certainly weren't those reserved forests. And
then fast forward, and some of those restrictions on hunting were relaxed.
Yep.
So you're saying that some of those restrictions were relaxed, and then we again, like, do we have a period of time where the expectation of being armed was relaxed too, in between? Because you're talking about 2 time periods where we're saying basically the same thing. So there's this continuity of hundreds of years where there's an expectation of.
Well, I don't mean to jump too far forward, but even in 1789 with the Second Amendment, there was expectation that the militia would have certain numbers of shot
balls,
available and certain powder,
right?
And
so
rifles
continuation
and
of.
So this is what makes it really
what
interesting.
What I want to make sure I'm understanding
is that the ability to hunt ebbed and flowed.
But the
expectation.
So the ability to hunt went on sort of this sine curve,
yes.
right? But then the expectation of having some sort of weapon, or the requirement, remained constant until, right? Because
before we get to the until, to say it may remain constant. So everybody understands what constant meant. Edward I, everybody's going to have a longbow. Edward III, said everyone in each city, in each body, at leisure time and on the holidays, the law was you had to go recreate with your bows and arrows. Edward IV continued that policy.
Now, Edward the Third, and when you talked about the recreation component, that was in 1369, right? And so, just as a signpost here, 1364 is the first recorded use of a firearm. So we've been talking about bows and arrows and things like that up until this point. But now we're talking about the advent of technology for firearms moving forward.
Yeah, and so the longbow stuck around big time. And so every Englishman under Edward IV every Englishman or Irishman dwelling in England had to have a bow of their height. And that was in law. Every town had to have an archery range. And why? It's because the longbow was recognized as every man's weapon. So now you're right when you say that firearms came on the scene. Mm-hmm. And initially when firearms came on the scene, there was an effort to create firearms regulations. It was ineffective. And ultimately...
how do you regulate the one firearm manufacturer?
Well,
that one dude in his barn.
Yeah, I was going to say.
It's like, I've been a blacksmith
now we're
for
talking
years.
about the 1500s.
Yeah.
And so what happened is at first there were, this might sound oddly familiar, but at first they just tried to regulate where they could be used or where you could practice them and things like that. And ultimately,
the guy that tried to regulate them got shot.
The king who developed said regulation finally said, now bag it, and by royal decree, quit trying.
But okay, so let's fast forward a little bit. Let's move into the 1600s because up till this point, this almost requirement to have.
It was Henry VIII, and it was 1514 that he tried restricting hunting with a handgun for the first time.
Okay,
there you go.
All right, but we're gonna skip that.
Okay,
now that you've said that, we'll skip because I think the 1600s is where you can really point to some events in the 1600s.
Some significant changes.
Right? And so we've been really running along this line where, so there's some, as you mentioned, even in the 1500s and even at the early advent of the firearms, some attempt to regulate firearms, but there's still this expectation that people are armed, like a requirement that they're armed. Right. But you have this ebb and flow of game laws like we talked about. So one constant, one
the black
one not.
laws.
And then you move into the 1600s and now you start to see an attempt of disarmament, right, by the crown.
Yeah, this is really interesting
which
because
is pretty significant.
Yeah, and you're going to talk, I think, a little bit more about that. I would say, you saw a greater attempt at managing game at that time too. So these game laws between 1603 and 1610, Parliament really got into game laws. They jumped right in and they started passing laws, talking about who could hunt, and it was very much class-based. It was very much based on your social class.
That's right. And so here we are in the 1600s. We have some regulation, and or we're starting to see not regulation, but we're starting to see the crown suppressing. So, for example, Kings Charles II and James II, right? They succeeded in using militias loyal to them to suppress political dissidents.
Yep.
And they did so by disarming...
Dissidents. Sorry.
Whatever.
You said descendants.
Did I? Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's late when we're recording this, but just,
In part, they did it in part by they disarmed their opponents.
That's right. And this is going to be important for people to understand.
And
they used
how they did
militia.
it.
They used a select militia.
Right.
And
That's what did I not say select?
No, and a select militia is different. Elizabeth I first coined the term militia, meaning an army basically of the people, the everyday guy with the longbow that we talked about before. The select militia was basically it was a unique group loyal to, and it was like, it was basically a standing army.
So here, so we had these select militias used to disarm their opponents. We also had the king, Catholic James. Well, let's see, under using the auspices of a 1671, it was just called the 1671 Game Act. The Catholic James II ordered general disarmaments of regions home to his Protestant enemies. So he used a law, a game law.
Yep, he's a game law.
Right. He used a law to regulate hunting as a means of disarming his enemies, basically.
That's right. He said, these are arms that you use for hunting, and therefore I'm going to create a law against hunting, and now I'm going to come take the arms away that you used to do them. Exactly.
So it's an interesting nexus here in the 1600s between the hunting community and what we start. The very next thing we see, what starts to be this establishment of a right to bear arms, right? And so just after that, so you have this 1671. And because of that, you had Englishmen that were getting really concerned about these concentrated military forces that were run by the state, right?
Coming and disarming people.
Coming and disarm. Exactly.
And what's fascinating, too, is that, so the Pilgrims, right?
Yeah.
1620.
Right.
The separatists. The reason that they left England is you had a group of people that were not of the favored class there who were having their rights taken away. And it wasn't just the right to bear arms. It was their freedom of religion. And so they moved.
Right.
They left. And first, they was the Netherlands, right? And then from there, they decided to go, that's where they, got the ship together and everything, and then headed for the colonies, which were already that time. There were already people in the U.S., but, all know the story. Cruising across, hit Plymouth Rock. Interestingly enough, one of the most famous firearms still in existence is it's the Mayflower gun, a 1620 flintlock that was in the hands of the first guy that stepped off onto the rock. And that rifle sits today in a museum. It's the same rifle that was carried on the Mayflower.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So I'm going to bounce back from Boston Harbor and head back to
Go ahead.
Or Plymouth Rock, and head back over to the mainland.
To
the island,
the continent, the continental breakfast.
Anyway, so we talked about the game law, right, and people getting concerned and worried about losing their arms, right? And so these folks then obtained an assurance from William and Mary in what's called the Declaration of Right, which then was later codified. We hear about our Bill of Rights, but this was codified as theirs. It was codified as the English Bill of Rights. And in that English Bill of Rights, the Protestants would never be disarmed. The Protestants had, in fact, the exact language are that the subjects which are Protestants may have arms for their defense suitable to their conditions and as allowed by law. And that right in the English Bill of Rights has long been understood now to be the predecessor to our Second Amendment.
It's interesting when you get context and you think about that and you think about the world that these people were living in. Let's go back.
But don't you think it's kind of funny?
Yeah.
That you had the crown take away hunting rights, which then led to the establishment of gun rights, which served as the basis of our Second Amendment.
Well, you talked about it previously on a previous podcast where we talked about, quote unquote, the right to hunt, and how some of the framers they felt like it was so understood that you didn't have to put it in there. People felt the same way about the right to keep and bear arms. There was discussion in the Constitutional Convention. And I'm going to back up a little bit. There was discussion whether or not it needed to be in there just because it was assumed. And the reason it was assumed, again, let's go back to the separatists or pilgrims, whatever you want to call them, who, land on Plymouth Rock. And those guys, you think about the world that they're living in. They were largely successful because they were lucky. They moved into an area where the major tribe that had been there had been decimated by disease. And they met up with Squanto, a guy who spoke English and was able to basically, help them to occupy this now empty spot of land, and it resulted in 50 years of relative peace. Well, at the end of that 50 years of peace, you have the first real big conflicts between colonists and Native Americans, and that resulted in the death of 1 out of every 10 military-aged males living in the colonies ends up dying in these conflicts. And so the musket, the Mayflower gun, when you think about the way these people lived, there were rules that you couldn't go out to your fields to tend your fields unless you went out armed. So this was the environment that that the colonists were living in. They were living in a very dangerous world. So they used those firearms for defense, and they were living in a world where they were always looking for, if you could find something to hunt and take it home, you were going to do that.
That's what they were eating. I mean, they were eating game. I mean, so around the same time in the 1600s, and this is a total sidebar anecdote, right? But around the same time in that they're having these battles. And I think this is fascinating because I'm going to fast forward to today and talk just very, very briefly, wolves, right? People are polarized on wolves on either side of this political spectrum. We have way too many wolves. We need more wolves. We've introduced them in too many places. We need to put them in more places. They're eating livestock. No, they're not really eating livestock. You have all of these different opinions on what's going on, and it seems like this incredibly, as you would say, complicated issue, right? Go back in time into the 1600s, and white-tailed deer were so critical to the diets of these folks. Hunting was so critical that some of the first records of wolves that you see in journals from folks that have come over to this new place we call the United States, some of the very first records you see of wolves are talking about wolves are killing all of our deer. We need to kill all these wolves because they're eating us out of house and home, right? And so having these firearms to protect their food source, or to have a food source in addition to public safety, or to not public safety, but in addition to protecting their welfare from other people, it was ingrained in them.
Yeah.
From the earliest times, right?
This duality of use, I think, maybe uniquely American in terms of like the right to keep and bear arms and kind of how they viewed it at that time. And if you think about running up to the Revolutionary War, I mean, can you imagine if you're living in that world and that if somebody would have said to you, "Hey, why don't you give me your flintlock?"
Which is exactly what happened, right? In those areas that the crown thought was most rebellious in the colonies and posed the greatest threat to the crown. Yeah. In hindsight, he was probably right. They posed a pretty big threat.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
one of the big.
But during that time, they started to disarm people in the U.S.
The
crown
General
did.
Gage wrote, to London regarding the idea of disarming certain counties. Is how he originally termed it. In 1774. A group of British regulars decided it was a great idea to raid a militia powder magazine, and then they tried it again later on, a few months later. They had to fight their way back to Boston. They lost 300 men, and it resulted in 16,000 militia descending on Boston and besieging the area. So it was a big deal.
Yeah. It was, and I think it's safe. It was one of... there were a number of contributing factors to the Revolutionary War, but an erosion of what these, at the time, they believed themselves to be Englishmen, right? And they tried to assert their rights as Englishmen to bear arms.
Yeah, they believed that they had a right to defense.
Right, and when that right, when the crown was effectively taking away that right. That's just another of a number of contributing factors that said, you know what, maybe this relationship isn't going to work out.
Yeah.
We need to see other people.
And a lot of people, you come back to you started off this podcast with, a well-regulated militia, right? A lot of people, there's this discussion of what that really meant. Well, the Continental Army was not the well-regulated militia. So the militia at the time, when people talked about the militia, those 16,000 militia that, I mean, we were talking about farmers.
We're talking about the guys that are out there
Yep.
that are experts at their craft, killing game to provide for
Yep.
their families, right?
Yep.
You know, the hunters of America.
Yes. And so of the 1,100 or so battles of the Revolutionary War, the great majority of them, skirmishes, the great majority of them involved militia.
Right.
And so...
And we succeeded, I mean, we being the United States succeeded because we had this, and Blackstone pointed this out.
Yeah.
Blackstone pointed this out, that we succeeded because we had this militia that was so ingrained and so well versed in using firearms in pursuing game. We've said it before.
It's not just firearm use as much as just accurate firearm use too. Deliberate ability to aim and shoot at a squirrel to get some meat.
Yep, and that's actually a quote. I mean, I'm sure you read it, is why you said it. There was a quote from one of the from the militia members who basically said, they took aim as if they were aiming at a squirrel, and those guys took out. By the time that Blackstone got back, I'm sorry, not Blackstone. By the time that Gage got back,
tell me who Gage is again.
General Gage, the military governor of Boston.
Yeah.
So by the time he got back after trying to take that second arsenal, the British attacked Breeds Hill. I'm not going to go into the whole story, but one of the guys there commented he took deliberate aim as at a squirrel and watched at least 20 men fall. Every one of the officer corps was shot.
Yeah.
Every one of them.
Yeah.
So it wasn't an accident.
Hunters and Blackstone pointed this out. And I'm gonna paraphrase.
Yeah.
But it was, hunters helped win the Revolutionary War.
Nephi's pointing this one piece out because it was a significant sort of time period, that pre-Revolutionary War, and because that was like 40% of the force, a tenth of the entire British Army in the colonies, right there.
Yeah.
In this one march, boom, we were knocking them off with sharpshooters.
Yeah.
Which is amazing, remarkable, and it changed warfare a little bit too.
Yes,
right? Yeah, it's not something that they'd ever seen before.
So let's get past the war now. Talk about the Constitutional Convention briefly.
Very briefly.
Go ahead. So going in there, you had, for example, what were they thinking about? What had shaped the thought process of Americans as they went to this convention? We've talked about it. It's that history that they all share. And whether it's living in England and that history that's been built of this expectation of the right of free men to bear arms, and it's also this environment that they've lived in where they've needed that. So Delegate Robert Whitehall said that people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and their own state or the United States, or for the purpose of killing game, and no law shall be passed for disarming the people. So there you have that tie again, where Robert Whitehall was saying, this is he mentioned it for their defense and for killing game. Sam Adams said, "The Constitution shall never be construed to authorize Congress to infringe the just liberty of the press or the rights of conscience, or to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceable citizens from keeping their own arms." New Hampshire was late to sign on in the Constitutional Convention, and one of the reasons they did is they wanted a provision. They suggested it, that Congress shall never disarm any citizen unless such as are or have been in actual rebellion. So
basically, commit a felony, lose your gun.
Yeah.
That's been pretty consistent application. That's kind of my takeaway.
Yeah, of course, this is contemporaneous with this. New Hampshire has this theory, but John Locke, if you were to study his works, his second treatise, which I just recently read for some reason.
That's pretty random.
Yeah, really, his concept here was that the Congress in the United States, the idea was that they would give and they would take the laws as necessary because they're the people, but the people who put them there are the ones who would make that decision. So it's surprising that even New Hampshire at that time would say actual rebellion would be a means or a reason to take back the firearms or take that right away, when the rebellion is the exercise of keeping the government in check. And so it's just sort of surprising to me.
It's really fascinating and uniquely American. And, as we talk about, I think on another podcast, we're going to talk about expansion of the West. And this kind of goes in.
Yeah, can we talk about that right at the end?
Right at the end, we will.
Yeah. But I want to tee that up a little bit.
And let's just do a final kind of gut check about where we came from in terms of the Second Amendment, what people's perception was, and then kind of where we are as our country versus kind of where everybody else was and how we got there. So you mentioned this very specifically, but George Tucker, who went on to be a justice on the Virginia Supreme Court, said, "Whenever standing armies are kept, and the right of the people to keep and bear arms is under any color or pretext whatsoever prohibited, liberty, if not already annihilated, is on the brink of destruction." And then he came to this, and this is what's important. In England, the people have been disarmed generally under the spacious pretext of preserving game. Now, it's really interesting because that's what ties that back in. And when you look at the difference in the European black laws versus the expectation in America, European game laws, written and unwritten, they worked, and such that, hunting is still excellent in many areas. However, Slav hunters in countries that became communist, for example, continued to observe the code of aristocratic past, the protocol that gave hunting a residual prestige verging on snob appeal long after social changes removed its origins. Unquote from the Encyclopedia Britannica. So that's not, me saying that.
Really?
Yeah. So there is, this kind of a unique difference in the way that people look at it and their perspective, and both of the right to hunt and how that is basically everyone's right? That's something that's kind of uniquely American. This wildlife belongs to people, and the right to keep and bear arms, which is also, we are one of 3 nations in the world that has that right in their constitution, and the others aren't worth talking about.
Because you don't know them, or they're not worth talking about?
Because they're not worth talking about.
Yeah. Well, I think the most fascinating piece for me of all of this is how you have a response to, in the 1600s, in England, right? A response to the crown regulating game as a means of disarming citizens, as a trigger. This is the absolute direct connection. It is the trigger to establishing in the English Bill of Rights a right to bear arms
that then comes
across and becomes the foundation, one of the foundational principles of our Constitution. And it's just amazing to me that you can actually tie that right to bear arms to an attempt to regulate hunting as a means of disarming.
And I can agree with you on that trigger, but I think it's important to say that the ammunition was laid up far.
You're right.
For centuries and centuries of this.
It established you had centuries of basically the people, citizens having to be armed, and then because of that inherently believing that they should be armed, and it sort of breeds this, it feels like after hundreds of years of being told to be armed, it's like, you don't need to tell me anymore, it's a right, right? That's kind of...
And, and it clearly is.
Yeah.
Why? Because it's number 2 in the Constitution.
Right.
And, I think we're going to talk about, when we talk about the expansion of America in the future, and we talk about where, how we moved from the Appalachians west, keep all this in the back of your head, this kind of, this frontiersman spirit, this American, whatever you want to call that gusto, that idea it's not just, it's not military or civilian. It's just kind of this frontiersman. Who is expected to have all these different skills of, woodsmanship and the ability to hunt and the ability to defend yourself and the use of a firearm and all these things.
To ford a river in a
load a
covered wagon and
hunt bison,
buy oxen and carry the
diphtheria.
and carry the right ammunition. And why am I saying all of
Tune
this?
in next time.
Can I tee it up?
Yeah, you can.
I really want to tee it up.
Go ahead.
So
it's going to excite you more than anybody else. So go for it.
It is, but it's probably a generational thing. For those people out here listening that are children of the 80s and had the great pleasure of playing Oregon Trail, the game Oregon Trail, on their Apple IIe computer on that 5-inch floppy disk. Right?
Speed it up, counselor.
We're going to do that. We are going to do a podcast where we settle the West. We play. Each of us are going to play the Oregon Trail, and we're going to talk about settling the West and the different things, the different land acquisitions and challenges that were faced from a policy and a legal standpoint, moving from Missouri to Oregon in the mid 1800s, and we're going to do it while we try and avoid cholera and diphtheria and wiping out the bison with our 1,500
Get ready
rounds
for
of
land
ammunition.
acquisitions with the Oregon Trail.
So stay tuned for that. But we're going to play Oregon Trail on a podcast here in a couple weeks. That'll be fun. All right. Anything else? Anything else? Did I just? Yeah.
There's no segue.
Just sort of. There's no segue for that, right? So it's just sort of stay tuned.
No, I think so. I will say, like, here's the interesting thing about this. When you looked at, I told you, like, spoiler alert, the hunting and the Second Amendment, the relationship. While it's there, don't assume that one is related to the other entirely. One was much bigger, and while there were triggers that occurred in there, they're not tied together.
There's a long storied history, but it's not easy to just look at it on its face and see the two.
Yeah.
Fact. I got nothing else to add, except that life is about experiences, so go have one.